Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session in our Accessing Archives workshop series. So for today's so-called expedition, I always like to use this map as a good way to show what we're going to cover today. And when I think of archives, I think of finding cool things, like buried treasure, things like that. And so that's why I went with this theme of using a treasure map to get where we need to be. So our first stop is going to answer the question, what is the University Archives? And then once you understand that, we're going to move on to how to incorporate them into your courses. So as a faculty member, using the University Archives and the vast amount of primary resources that are in the archives, incorporating them into your courses may sound tricky, but you can actually do it in many different ways. So we're going to cover that next. And then finally, how does this benefit students? So if you're incorporating archive resources into your courses, I'm going to demonstrate how it benefits students. And then once we figure out all of those things, you get to where you need to be, which is our so-called, buried treasure, or X marks the spot, if you want to call it that. So first we're going to start with, what is an archive? If you're not familiar what the concept of an archive is, it is basically a collection of records that are deemed culturally and historically significant. And the culturally and historically significant is really the main idea here, because that's why the items are saved. Usually, archives document the history of something, either a person, organization, a time period, or something similar like that, through photographs, documents, memorabilia, artwork, and other artifacts that no longer serve their original purpose. And so the point of an archive is to save items that are, historically significant, but they don't serve their original purpose anymore. And so that's why they're able to be in the archive, because they're not being used for their original purpose anymore. And so a lot of things that no longer serve original purposes that can be found in archives include blueprints and paperwork and trophies and event programs. A lot of those things are time sensitive. So if there's a program for, let's say, a commencement that happened a couple years ago, that program already happened. So the brochure that's connected to that event is no longer serving its original purpose. Archives can also be region specific or region exclusive, and that's what makes them so special. A lot of archives will specify or use very specific materials, so they're not going to just take anything and put it in there. So they can be very specific in that way. But that means you can go and find really, really cool materials, depending on which archive you visit. And kind of the main point of an archive is to find a balance between preservation and accessibility. While the point of an archive is to provide safe accessibility for archive materials, it is also important that these items are preserved in proper ways. So while using the materials and allowing them to be accessible to users can potentially put the items in danger because they can get damaged or lost when being used by patrons. So the point of an archive is to allow that accessibility as much as possible, while also maintaining the integrity and preservation of the materials that are being used. And so going with kind of our treasure theme here, I like to use Indiana Jones quotes for this presentation. So a lot of archive materials, in the words of Indiana Jones, he would say that they belong in a museum. So I do want to drive home that archives are not just for books or papers. One of the largest archives in the world is obviously the National Archives in the United States. And one of the archives and collections that they have is the National Film Registry at the Library of Congress. And so I think this is a really cool archive just because it shows that archives aren't just for paper. With today's technology and technology innovations, there's a lot of multimedia content out there. And so archives have had to kind of evolve a little bit to be able to store not just paper, but also multimedia items. And so the National Film Registry, which is on this website here, they select 25 films each year to showcase the range and diversity of American film heritage to increase awareness of preservation. And so I'm going to actually pull up the complete listing here. If you try to think of a film that you really, really enjoy, or maybe a favorite film, it's fairly likely that it will probably be on this list. Just to show you an example, my favorite film is Back to the Future, 1985 film, and it is in fact in the National Film Registry, released originally in 1985, and it was included in the National Film Registry in 2007. So you can see there's a lot of well-known and famous movies on here. They're all American, I believe, or if they aren't, I think they choose items that highlight American heritage. But I did want to show you this briefly just because, not all archives are just paper. It's a lot of different types of items nowadays. And in some ways, it's almost more so multimedia items over just paper items. And we also just got word of the films that were selected for the 2022 induction of the National Film Registry. So some of the ones that they chose were Iron Man, The Little Mermaid, Hairspray, When Harry Met Sally, and Carrie. So those are the ones that got inducted this year. So kind of moving on from that, giving you guys the idea of archives aren't just paper items. These are some pictures of some items in the University of Findlay Archives. We have a University of Findlay branded Coca-Cola can from 1999. The Coca-Cola is not in the can anymore. It is no longer serving its original purpose of quenching the thirst of a person who buys it. So that is why it is in the archive. We have a photo from the 1915 men's basketball team and a homecoming cookie contest trophy from 2010. So this trophy is another example of something that's not serving its original purpose anymore because it was awarded to whoever won that contest that year. And so the contest was 13 years ago as of this recording. So the person who got that trophy, it was meant to recognize the winner, and the event has passed. So it is no longer serving its original purpose. So those are just some items that we do have in the archives, but there are many others, and many others that are not just photos or paper. There's a lot of really cool non-traditional items that are up there. The archives is actually on the second floor of Schaefer Library, if you weren't aware. But kind of going off of that, the University of Findlay Archives is basically a collection of university records that date back to the founding of the institution in 1882. It documents the history of the university through photos, documents, different types of memorabilia, like that trophy you saw in the last slide. There's also artwork up there and a lot of other artifacts that are deemed historically and culturally significant, and also no longer serving their original purpose. And so, like I kind of was stressing before, archive items are saved because they're historically and culturally significant. The mission of the University Archives at the University of Findlay is to support the teaching and research endeavors of faculty, students, and community members by making materials available that relate to the history and culture of the University of Findlay. So the purpose of having the archives in Schaefer Library is to document the university's history and also provide research materials and teaching opportunities for faculty, students, and community members. So, you're thinking, okay, there's these archives, what's the point? What's their purpose? Why do I even use them? Why can't I just go online and find sources there? Or why can't I just use materials that are in a regular library setting? In the words of Indiana Jones, sometimes you don't know and you make this up as you go. But there's actually some reasons why archives are important. So first, archives, and on the library side, Archives provide special storage and treatment as well as protection for special or rare items and not just, old junk. Some items can be considered rare or very special depending on the institution. Some items, they may be the only copy in existence in the world, and as a result, they can't just be sitting on a shelf. They need special care and treatment. Many of the items are primary resources in most archives, and so those are really great for conducting research or doing any kind of project that would require primary resources. Primary resources provide direct evidence from a specific time period, and so they can be a very, very cool source to get information from. Archives also help with researching specific topics where materials may be hard to find. So if you're having trouble finding materials on a very specific topic, an archive might have some materials that specialize in that topic. And so that's where you might get most of your items from. It also provides access to items and documents that may not be available anywhere else. So a good example is the University of Findlay Archives. It is likely that most institutions, besides us, other archives, they're not going to have the vast collection of materials that cater to the University of Findlay or that are about the University of Findlay and its history. So if you want to get any kind of historical items or materials that relate to the history of the University of Findlay, the archive that we have on the second floor is going to be your best bet because that's where most of the items are stored. It is possible that, other institutions may have a couple, but they probably don't specialize in University of Findlay materials. So if you kind of are following here, that's why you can only access certain items that aren't going to be available anywhere else at a specific archive. They're going to have a very special collection and very special collection development policy. And so they're not going to just take any item. They're going to they will sometimes focus on a very specific category of items. Archives also let you examine different historical perspectives. Again, kind of linking back to the primary resources element. Primary resources, while they're not necessarily, they can still be biased and inaccurate, but they are directly from the time period in which they were written. So they let you examine different historical perspectives in that way. And so as a result, archives make really, really good hands-on opportunities for students. And there are definitely other types of archives out there. There's obviously university archives, which is an archive at a university, but there's also other types of archives like corporate and government archives. There's historical societies like the Hancock Historical Museum, which would also fall under the museums category. There's religious archives, usually with churches or religious organizations. There's film and web archives as well, kind of going into that multimedia element. So hopefully, after kind of seeing some of these, you understand a little bit better the purpose of archives and why they're really, really good to use in an academic setting. So how do you access the university archives? There's a couple different ways that you can. So the first way is to visit the University Archives Guide on the Schaefer Library website. In the words of Indiana Jones, X never really marks the spot. Sometimes you have to do some digging, but we try our best to make our stuff as accessible as possible. So online, I'll kind of show you where you can find the website, but we have a holdings manual, a link to Finley Memory, and other related resources. And so I'm going to show you where to find that. So what you're going to want to do is visit our website first, visit our homepage. And then you're going to want to scroll to the bottom and go to the research guides icon. And then there's going to be a bunch of umbrellas, and you want to scroll down to the one that says University of Findlay, and then click on University Archives. There's a couple other ways you can get to this guide. This is just the way that works for me, that's the way I get to it. But you can see on our guide, there are different tabs at the top, so you might want to check these out depending on what you're interested in. And we have a holdings manual on the left. If you click on that, that gives you basically a giant searchable PDF that has a list of all different items that we have. They're kind of general in a sense, but it gives you a really good idea of what kinds of items we have upstairs. And they're organized by these subjects. So depending on what you're interested in, you can check out these Roman numerals and also use the find function on your internet browser to see if we have anything that you're looking for. So I just did a search for homecoming and it shows you which results are in the document. So that's kind of what the PDF looks like. We also have a thing called Findlay Memory, which is our digital archive. It has a lot of yearbooks and handbooks and photographs on there, and they're all available digitally. And you just have to click the link here to open that up. And so you can search either in general by going to the search bar, or you can click on one of these item types and search that way. So I'm actually going to go to images, just to have an example here. And I'm going to click browse. And so it shows you all of the results. There's 412 photos. We've got some of the football team. There's some events. There's one on the homecoming parade from 1967. Those costumes are interesting for the baton twirlers. So whenever you click on something in Findlay Memory, it will pull up the item on the left, and then you can check out the item description at the bottom. And that gives you a little bit more context, a little bit more information. If there's text in the item, you can also go to here and search the text itself. I'll go ahead and see if I can pull up something that has text on it. All right, so I'm going to click on this one right here from November 1891, and I'm going to do a search for, let's do a search for Findlay. We should definitely get a result there. So it says there's 64 results, and it tells you what pages the results are on. And so that's kind of really nice because it makes it a lot easier to search for something. Like if you're searching for a name or a date, it's a really useful tool. So on page 3, there was a reference to the word Findlay. Now, there are some instances where it will highlight the word in yellow on the page. If it doesn't, there's sometimes a transcription of the text at the bottom. Now, for some reason in this case, it looks like it's not on there. So we have been working to try to figure out why it's not quite pulling up the correct word or the highlighting, but that's how it usually does work. I'm gonna see if it pulls up anything with the highlighted word. If not, you may just have to skim the page to find it. So it may take a little extra time, but at least it tells you that the word is on there. So that's Findlay Memory. We also have some links to some other campus digital archives. Now, these aren't managed by Schaefer Library, but these archives are managed by the University of Findlay and their respective departments. So we've got some links to some digital publications. We have some of the print versions of some of these publications, but we don't necessarily have the electronic versions because we don't manage their archive. But we've got links to like the Pulse digital publication, Findlay Newsroom as well, Findlay Mag, and ArchLink. And then we also have a link to the athletics website that has athletics archives, which has news releases, rosters, and information on different sports. So you can just click on one of those and it'll take you straight to the site has the archived information. And some of these go back not super far, like this one goes back to 2010, but some go back a little bit farther than that. But it's kind of useful for getting access to like news and scheduling and rosters and stuff like that if you're interested in anything athletic related. So that's kind of an overview of our website. We do have a couple other tabs here. We've got a newspaper collection that we're currently working on. We have a lot of newspapers, so we're slowly working through that with circle PDFs with the newspaper title, article titles, and things like that in there. And then we just have a little introductory page that talks about the history of the University of Findlay. If you're looking for items, you're really just going to want to look at that holdings manual on the home page, the Findlay Memory digital archive, or the related links that go to the different publication archives. There's also a thing called Ohio Memory, which may be of interest to you. Like if I go back here, I'll kind of show you where you can find that. There actually might be a link to it on our guide, as there should be. If not, I know there should be a link in our A to Z database list. And if there isn't one there, then you can always just Google it and pull up the link that way. Okay, it looks like it is not. So what we're going to do, we're going to pull it up this way. So Ohio Memory is a digital archive that we don't manage, but it's a collaborative digital archive with the Ohio History Connection and the State Library of Ohio. And the University of Findlay does have items in here, but it's great for searching all different types of things related to university history and things like that. And so we got actually quite a few results there. So I'm actually going to go back and I'm going to click on collections. Just see browse by collection, browse by newspapers, and you might be able to browse. Yeah, you can browse by contributor. And you can pull up University of Findlay that way. And so this way it'll show you, we only have 9 items right now in at least tagged as University of Findlay items. That doesn't mean that University of Findlay isn't mentioned in other items in this repository. There's a couple things here if you're interested and want to search for this database further. So those are all the different ways you can access the archives online. Of course, you can visit the archives in person. Visits are only available by appointment at the moment, but we also do scheduled class visits and tours for classes if you want to bring your class in and do some kind of archive activity. And if you just have like an archive related question that can easily be answered by us, kind of doing some research, you feel free to send us your question and we can find an answer for you. So some benefits for archives with students is that it caters to different types of learners. Since there's so many different archive items, each different type of item will cater to different learning types. So, there's obviously visual learners, there's kinesthetic learners, auditory, and then reading and writing. So you're probably going to always find an item or archive material that's going to cater to that type of learner. Using archives also develops critical skills like evaluating evidence when you're using primary resources. It also provides detective skills and problem solving. So if you're looking at a document from an archive, maybe not all the information is available. Maybe part of the document got ripped off, or part of it burned, or part of it's missing for some reason. And so you have to kind of use problem solving and detective skills in order to kind of make an inference or figure out what is missing. It also develops critical research skills, as well as extracting relevant information from large materials. Doing that can be a daunting task, and being able to do that efficiently is a very good skill to have, just in general. It also develops source use and evaluation. When you're using different types of sources in an archive, it's not just a journal article or a book. Since you're using different types of sources, it really makes you use your brain and think about, why was the source made? Who was the author? What was the date? Why was it published? Those kinds of questions, and kind of just answering the why. Why does this item exist? Why did we save it? And why is it important? And so all of these skills are really helpful in academic success and even just life after graduation. So, in the words of Indiana Jones, the benefits for students are fortune and glory. So, to use archives in your courses, you can really use them in several ways. The first way is, of course, doing some kind of class archives visit. We can give you guys a tour and allow students to interact with exhibits and materials. And before the class visit, you can always let us know ahead of time, and we can set up some displays and some materials that can cater to a course topic. We actually had a class come in recently that did an assignment on primary resources. They needed to have one primary resource in their research paper. And so we grabbed a bunch of primary resources of different kinds for the class, and we had them complete a primary resource evaluation activity. And that seemed to go pretty well with the students because they liked interacting with the different items. You can also have an assignment or project tied to a course learning outcome, and you can always relate that to archives. So you can have them do a research project on a topic. It helps develop research skills. If you have them use archives because they're unique in the materials that they have, they offer practical application of course content. So, archives are usually very history centric, but you can also apply them to art and many other different disciplines. You can also use archives in creative writing. You can use them as influence for characters or settings or anything that you might need to help come up with for some kind of creative writing. Lastly, you can also use archives as research project and papers and essays. So students in general may have topics that they choose that require information from primary resources. And primary resources are where you're going to find those in archives. And of course, using primary resources in creative writing again, that's another thing that people don't think about, but it can be useful for getting ideas. So to kind of drive this point further, archives aren't just for historians and the history discipline. I have some examples here of how you can implement archives into courses that aren't just history. So for history, obviously you can have some kind of traditional research paper on University of Findlay history using primary resources. You can also create a documentary. It's kind of a multimedia project, including footage of different resources that you use. You can also do like a paper on the history of Hancock County. There's so many different things you can do. But I kind of like the idea of having different disciplines using archive resources. So in the discipline of communication, one thing you can do is analyze the political rhetoric of newspapers from a time period. In the field of art, you can do an interpretation and analysis of different art pieces, or you can even create your own art with inspiration from archive materials. In the STEM field, you can also do things like create a 3D printed model of an existing or defunct building, and you can get this information to create the 3D model by using primary resources like photos and blueprints of the building that you want to build. And so this is just one example for each discipline, but there are countless others that I'm sure people have used and done that also work really well. So this was the activity that we did for the live workshop. But if you want to do this on your own, doing some online research with one of our digital archives, you're more than welcome. But we had people pick an artifact that we brought down from the archives, and we had them come up with a mock assignment or activity that you could use in a course. And some questions to consider when you're doing this is think about how it aligns with a core concept that you want students to learn. You know, does it line up with one of the core concepts? Because that's really what you want to drive home. Think about if it aligns with a common teaching strategy. You know, you want students to be able to do the assignment, but you also want to be able to assess the assignment when they turn it in. It's also important to think about if this would get students more interested in the content. And with the primary resource activity that we had a class do a while back, we think that really actually got them interested because they got to choose the item that they got to do the activity with. And that so they chose, you know, the item that was most interesting to them. And so getting students interested is kind of really the big thing here because if they're not interested, they're not going to care and they're not going to see the purpose and the importance of it. And so, kind of going off of that, if this would make the course more memorable, that would also be helpful. Because, you know, it's one of those things where, you know, doing one cool little assignment in one class, if it really sticks with a student, it's going to be one of those things that they're going to remember for the rest of their life. There's a couple of things that I experienced in my high school and college career that a teacher did that really, really stuck with me. And it was something that not only made the assignment or the learning outcome more interesting, but it was memorable. And that is why it stuck with me. So if you're able to do that by using archives in your courses, that'll really help with student learning. And so we ended up talking about this in the live session, but with the questions to consider for this, this might help you figure out how to use these artifacts in the archives in your courses. If you want to see some class collaboration examples, I have a link to the University of Wisconsin Green Bay, and they have a page on their site that talks about the different classes that are being archives in courses. It's a really cool way that they organize the site. So it talks about different ways that archive materials were used. So one of the really cool examples was talking about um, Twitter reenactment, which you would think that Twitter isn't a archive resource, but it actually in a way it can be considered one because it's a primary resource that is directly from the time period in which it was posted. So it's kind of a cool thing. When you click on the topic, it basically explains what the course was and what the context and assignment was. So if you want to check this out further and kind of need some ideas, this would be a great place to start, just to kind of see different examples. And this link is also available on Schaefer Library's Canvas page for this workshop. And there's other resources and links on there to help you incorporate archives into your courses and give you some ideas. So if you would like more information on the University Archives, again, you can visit our archives guide on our research guides page. We have an Accessing Archives Canvas page that's available for faculty to access. And you can also contact the below email or phone number if you have a specific question that you would like us to answer. So I hope that this session introduced you really well to the University of Findlay Archives, and it gave you some ideas on how to incorporate archives into your courses. Thanks for listening, and we will see you guys for the next session.